Before a stunned nation, Jasmine Crockett rips open Tim Scott's darkest secret. He stole a $32 million fund meant for veterans and turned it into his playground of wealth. The chamber goes silent, then erupts with fury. Truth has a face, and so does corruption. When the mask falls, will Tim Scott's downfall shake all of America? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The U.S. Capitol chamber was silent, cameras glowing red as the nation tuned in. This was no ordinary hearing. Congress had launched a live investigation into the Honoring Veterans Fund, worth tens of millions now under suspicion for missing money. Every eye in America waited to see which truth would stand and which lie would shatter. The air was heavy electric, ready to explode at the first spark. At the front sat Jasmine Crockett, a rising congresswoman with a reputation sharper than steel. Young, fearless, and relentless, she was known for questions that sliced through excuses like a knife. Her stance was steady, her expression unflinching. She was ready to strike. Across from her sat Senator Tim Scott, a seasoned figure long praised as the clean face of his party. He leaned back, smirked, and muttered to his aide, "A rising girl thinks she can teach me a lesson." The taunt dripped with arrogance, echoing through the chamber. Everyone sensed what was coming: numbers, testimony, luxury exposed, and the tape no one could deny. The execution had begun. The silence in the chamber was suffocating as the chairman's gavel echoed once more. The transition was seamless after the opening words came. The evidence, the kind of evidence that could topple a career. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, her eyes locked on Tim Scott, her hand lifting a stack of documents. Then with a nod, the LED screen behind her came alive in a blaze of white light. On the massive screen appeared a spreadsheet, line after line of cold numbers. Crockett's voice cut through the silence. "Here are 47 wire transfers totaling $32 million. Every cent was supposed to support our veterans. But look closely, those funds vanished." The camera zoomed in as the figures flashed larger, each entry a pulse of betrayal. Gasps spread across the chamber, the kind that ripple like a wave through a stunned crowd. Tim Scott leaned back, forcing a chuckle, his voice thick with condescension. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his lips curling into a smirk, "don't try to read a balance sheet like a child learning the alphabet." His words were sharp, dripping with mockery, but the tremor in his hand betrayed him. A few senators shifted uncomfortably. Others raised their brows at the arrogance. The tension tightened as if every word was a match falling closer to a fuse. Crockett didn't flinch. With a calm precision, she tapped her finger, and the screen shifted again. This time it was not just numbers. A graphic map lit up, tracing glowing red lines across the country. Each line was a transfer of money. The audience leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The destinations were clear: not to hospitals, not to veteran rehabilitation centers, not to nursing homes or family assistance programs. Every path ended at the same point, glowing bright like a wound on the map. Her voice rose. Not a single dollar reached a veteran in need. Every cent was redirected. The screen zoomed in to reveal the final destination: Palmetto State Constructors, Inc. The name burned across the LED display. Crockett let the silence sink in before speaking again. "This company is owned and operated by none other than the senator's cousin. This is not charity, it is a pipeline. And every dollar is a drop of blood taken from those who already gave theirs for this country." Whispers broke out among the lawmakers seated around the chamber. Some leaned toward each other, whispering frantically. A few shook their heads, faces pale. In the press gallery above, reporters scribbled furiously, pens scratching across notebooks, laptops glowing as headlines were typed in real time. Cameras zoomed tighter on the screen, broadcasting every detail into homes across America. The audience watching from living rooms across the nation froze. They saw the numbers, the map, the company name. They saw the story unfold in brutal simplicity. Money intended for wounded veterans was siphoned into a construction firm tied to Tim Scott's own family. The sense of betrayal was tangible, a heaviness pressing down on everyone watching. Crockett leaned closer to the microphone, her voice lower, deliberate and searing. "This is not support for veterans. This is a blood trail leading straight into Senator Scott's pocket." The words cracked through the chamber like a gunshot. The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, the sound of camera shutters snapping rapid fire. Some senators covered their mouths, others slammed their pens on the desk. The audience at home felt a jolt of raw anger and disbelief. Scott tried to maintain composure, his smile tightening into a thin line. He shook his head, forced out a laugh that rang hollow. "This is distortion," he muttered. "Pure distortion." But the sweat beading on his forehead told another story. His eyes flickered to the screen, then to his papers, then back to Crockett. His smirk had faltered, and for the first time his face betrayed a crack in the armor. The chamber was alive with electricity now. Crockett stood unshaken while Scott's words hung in the air, weaker than they were meant to be. The contrast was unmistakable, one side presenting facts as sharp as daggers, the other sinking into denial. And America watching live could see exactly who was bleeding. The tension from the financial documents still hung in the air when Tim Scott leaned back in his chair. His smirk had returned colder this time, and his voice dripped with disdain. "Perhaps you'll bring in an actor next," he sneered, his eyes sliding toward Jasmine Crockett. "Someone to cry on cue and make your story more convincing." The words slashed through the chamber, mocking not only Crockett, but the very idea that real pain could be presented here. For a second, some senators shifted uncomfortably, and even the press gallery fell quiet. Then the heavy wooden doors creaked open. The room turned as a man in a wheelchair rolled slowly forward. He was in his late 40s uniform jacket draped over his lap, both legs gone, from the knees down. His name was Sergeant Michael Torres, a decorated veteran who had served 2 tours in Iraq. In his trembling hands, he held a single sheet of paper, a rejection letter from the Honoring Veterans Fund. The sight of him alone made the mockery in Scott's words curdle in the air. The cameras zoomed in as Torres stopped at the center. His voice was unsteady but strong enough to carry. "I lost my legs in Fallujah." He began, the words weighted with memory and sacrifice, his eyes fixed on Scott, sharp with betrayal. "But Tim Scott took the blood money meant for me and used it to build a tennis court." The words landed like a thunderclap. The chamber fell into a silence so heavy it pressed against the chest of every person inside. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Scott's smug grin flickered, then collapsed. The chamber stayed frozen, senators staring, reporters' pens halted, mid-sentence cameras capturing every twitch of his face. Then, with a voice roughened by years of carrying unspoken anger, Torres spoke again. "I sat in my living room, Senator Scott. I watched you on TV promising every veteran that not a dollar would be wasted, that we were your priority. You looked into the camera and said, 'Every cent will go to those who sacrificed.' And I believed you." His hand shook as he lifted the rejection letter higher. "This is what I got," instead a letter saying there was nothing left. The stillness cracked. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, rising to a low roar. Some senators bowed their heads, others clenched their jaws. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards, headlines already forming. And in living rooms across America, veterans and their families leaned forward, stunned by the betrayal spelled out so plainly. Torres's voice trembled, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable. "You told America we mattered. You told me I mattered. But when the money came, you built yourself luxury instead. I fought for this country with everything I had, and you call this honor?" The words echoed against marble and wood, each syllable cutting into Scott's crumbling composure. The man who had just mocked Crockett now sat rigid, pale, his smile gone. The silence shattered when the chamber erupted. Gasps and shouts collided, some voices rising in anger, others calling out in disbelief. A wave of fury rolled through the audience. One senator slammed a hand on the table. From the press seats came the rapid-fire clicks of camera shutters. Viewers at home saw it unfold in real time, the fall of arrogance against the weight of truth. The camera cut to Tim Scott's face. The smirk had vanished, replaced by a grimace. His lips moved, fumbling for control, but the words stumbled out broken. This is just one isolated case," he muttered, his voice cracking under the weight of the room's rage. But his protest was drowned instantly by the sound of anger rising like a storm. Every attempt to dismiss the testimony was swallowed whole. The chamber had turned. Scott's mockery now clung to him, like a curse, his arrogance replaced by a desperate attempt to breathe under the flood of fury. What had begun as a taunt had backfired with devastating force, and America had witnessed it live. The chamber was still vibrating from Sergeant Torres's testimony when Tim Scott tried to claw back control and reclaim the narrative he just lost. He leaned toward the mic and let out a chilly laugh. "Ms. Crockett, you must be watching too many documentaries," he said, words slick with contempt. A few allies chuckled on cue, but the sound died fast in the hard acoustics of the room. Jasmine Crockett did not blink. She lifted one finger toward the control booth. The lights dipped and the LED wall roared to life. On screen appeared a satellite photograph of a seaside estate on the Charleston coast, crisp enough to count roof tiles and trace the shadow of each palm along the patio. A flycam sweep followed, gliding over a blue rectangle of a pool, lingering on a four-car garage, then knifing down a stairwell to a climate-controlled wine cellar. The camera paused on the terrace where stone balustrades faced the ocean like a parade. Gasps scattered through the chamber as the images flipped to architectural permits and utility records tied to the same parcel. Crockett's voice stayed level. "While veterans have to sit in wheelchairs, Mr. Scott sips wine in a seaside mansion." She turned her gaze back to Scott, letting the silence chew at the edges of his confidence. Then the evidence shifted to paper, a high-resolution invoice stamped in bold amount $5,000. The payee was Palmetto State Constructors, Inc., listed for residential improvements, and at the bottom was a wet ink signature, Tim Scott. A hush rolled across the seating as Crockett zoomed closer, the looping stroke of the T filling the wall. From the witness table, a man in a dark suit stood and spoke into the auxiliary microphone. "My name is Daniel Huxley, household manager at 14 Seaglass Way, Charleston. I confirm this is the senator's residence." He swallowed and continued. "I received vendors at the service gate, saw the tennis court poured, and watched Mr. Tim Scott inspect the wine cellar. I also saw him approve this invoice." His statement landed like a hammer plane, careful and devastating. It left no path of escape in the geometry of facts. Scott reached for the mic, but his knuckles were pale, and his hand trembled as if the air had turned cold. This is a misinterpretation," he stammered, but the words wobbled thin and unconvincing. The camera cut tight to his face. The earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a sheen of sweat. Crockett said nothing, letting the frames and figures do the talking, as the room drew a breath that never exhaled. Then the sound exploded, chairs scraped, voices rose, flashbulbs erupted, and from the press row a reporter shouted, "Biggest scandal of the decade." The force of it all rolled over Scott like surf, and for the first time he looked small in the leather chair. The chairman's gavel slammed for order, but the noise only thinned. It did not fade. Phones vibrated across the dais as producers from every network barked for tighter shots. An older senator whispered, "God help us," while aides traded frantic notes and pointed back to the $5,000 and $1,000 line. Huxley leaned again to the mic, voice steady now. "I witnessed deliveries logged to Palmetto State Constructors, and I escorted Mr. Scott to the cellar during the final walkthrough." Scott fumbled with a water bottle, the plastic crinkling loud in the microphones, and managed only a dry swallow. Crockett kept her eyes on the screen, unmoving, as if daring the ink on the signature to deny itself before a nation watching live now. The uproar from the mansion images was still fading when Tim Scott jolted upright, jaw set like stone. He planted his elbows on the table and hurled his voice at the microphones, forcing a calm into his tone. "All of this is staged. Ms. Crockett is performing a cheap play." The line came fast and hard, meant to slice the air and retake the room, a counterpunch from a seasoned politician. A few allies forced laughs, but their eyes drifted toward the camera's calculating angles, afraid of the clip that would outlive them. The chairman peered over his glasses fingers, drumming the oak, waiting to see whether the punch would land or skid. Somewhere a pen clicked and stopped, the only sound in a chamber holding its breath. Jasmine Crockett held his stare and answered with a thin, cool smile that said she had prepared for this exact beat. She reached into a folder and drew out a slim silver USB, turning it so the overhead lights dashed along its edge like a signal flare. "Documents can be faked, but there is one thing you cannot deny: your own voice." She spoke the sentence evenly, each word set like a brick, then raised the drive high enough for the back rows to see her hand, steady, unhurried. The technicians looked to the dais fingers, hovering above the console, waiting for a nod that had not yet come, sweat beading under the headphones. The gallery leaned forward as one, the hush sharpening to a blade, the air tight as wire already. A heavy stillness pressed down the kind that makes a crowd forget to breathe and count the beats of their hearts. Shoulder to shoulder, people straightened as if bracing for impact they could already feel creeping closer. Scott's mouth tightened. His eyes skittered from the black screen to the bright shard in Crockett's hand, and back again, searching for an exit that did not exist. He tried to muster a smile, but it broke halfway, brittle and useless, leaving only a thin line and a twitch at the corner. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple jumping, and reached for water. He did not want the bottle crackling under his grip like dry leaves. For the first time today, he was now facing something he could not control, and the whole room absolutely knew it, and the cameras drank it in. The hush that followed the silver USB was razor thin, and then Jasmine gave a small nod toward the tech booth to begin. She slid the drive into the console. The indicator light blinked green, and the LED wall switched to a black screen with a single timestamp pulsing. A soft chime, a click, and the audio file rolled. Recorded call, April 12, 9:43 p.m. Participants: Senator Tim Scott and Evan Pike, Campaign Finance Director, a neutral system voice announced. The room leaned in as one. A phone line crackle filled the chamber, then a man's voice, unmistakable and steady. It was Tim Scott speaking flatly to Evan Pike. Cut the money for those veterans. They are no longer useful to the campaign. Move everything to the Palmetto Dunes project. Those veterans are useless. The words moved through the microphones like a cold wind. Every syllable was clean, close, and personal, leaving no room for spin or confusion. Chairs stopped creaking. Even the cameras seemed to quiet themselves. The shock hit in stages. First a stunned silence so complete it rang. Then the human sounds, a muffled gasp, a pen falling, a whispered Jesus from the press gallery. On screen, the waveform kept crawling, a blue ribbon of proof that would not blink. Tim Scott sat forward, eyes locked on the speaker, as if willing it to shut off. He dabbed his forehead with a folded note card that immediately went translucent with sweat. Jasmine Crockett stepped to the mic without raising her voice. Palmetto Dunes is not a hospital, she said. It is a 36-hole golf resort with a 5-star hotel and oceanfront villas. The screen answered for her, flipping to aerial stills, booking brochures, and vendor schedules, cart paths etched like scars across the grass. This is where the money went. Crockett continued, not to rehab centers, not to mobility chairs, not to medication. She let the last word hang as heavy as a verdict. The public gallery began to murmur, louder this time, anger waking up in waves. Someone near the back stood and blurted, "Oh my God, another project!" A second voice echoed, "Another project!" The phrase multiplied, bouncing from row to row, from the balcony to the floor, collecting force like a storm rolling down a valley. Reporters leaned over the rail, snapping photos of the waveforms and the booking brochure side by side. A producer pressed a phone to his ear and shouted, "We need this audio up now." Tim Scott did not move. The color had drained from his face, leaving him the pale shade of office paper. His jaw worked, but nothing came out. The room had stolen his oxygen and his lines at once. A drop of sweat broke free and tracked down his temple, glinting under the panel lights. He reached for the water bottle, missed the cap twice, and finally gave up, hands flat on the table. Like a man bracing for an impact he could no longer dodge. There was no exit in the evidence, no ally in the audio, no spin left to spend. The file clicked off, but the echo did not. It sprinted out of the chamber and into the world. Newsrooms jolted awake, editors barking orders, producers waving their arms like runway beacons. Within minutes, the first alerts hit home screens, bright banners cutting through dinner traffic and quiet hallways. Scott calls veterans useless. The phrase was as short as a punch and just as hard, and it multiplied across platforms with the speed of panic. By dawn, front pages from coast to coast carried the same thunderhead headline: Scott calls veterans useless. Morning radio hosts replayed the audio and let the silence that followed do the talking. Comment sections flooded with rage, grief, and disbelief. Gold Star families posted side-by-side photos of their loved ones in the transcript line. At local diners, the quote hung in the air above coffee mugs and folded newspapers. No one needed context to understand the insult. On Capitol Hill, the political dam cracked. Senators who had hedged for years stepped to microphones and dropped the caveats. "We need a special investigation," one declared, and then it became a chorus. We need a special investigation. Staffers drafted letters at sprint speed staplers, clacking like metronomes of consequence. Committee chairs compared calendars and jurisdiction maps, carving a fast lane for subpoenas. A bank of screens in a cable control room told the second half of the story. Producers cued two clips back to back, Tim Scott leaning into his mic with a tight smile, and Tim Scott blinking in silence as his own voice condemned him. The Chiron read from mockery to mute, while anchors narrated the arc in tight spare sentences. Over and over the package ran the smirk, the line, the USB, the flat stare. Viewers could not look away from the simple geometry of hubris meeting its evidence. Neighborhoods felt it too in whispers and hard conversations that carried to porches and church basements. Veterans' halls filled early chairs scraping as people came to watch the replay together. Someone hit pause on the frame where Scott's face lost its last defense, and no one spoke for a long time. Finally, the room found its verdict spoken as if to the screen itself. One side is the truth, the other is lies exposed. The sentence settled like a stone in water and sent rings through every table. Back at the Capitol, the numbers grew teeth. More offices signed on to the demand until the phrase special investigation felt less like politics and more like a duty roll call. Draft resolutions stacked up on the clerk's desk. Camera crews camped outside doorways, catching every stern jaw on its way to a microphone. Networks rolled a split screen on the left. Scott's taunt to Jasmine Crockett, on the right the instant he fell silent. Between those two panels lived the whole story, and the country understood it without a caption. Phones lit up with push alerts while highway billboards flipped to breaking red, each display repeating the same stark line Scott calls, "Veterans useless." Evening papers at subway kiosks sold out before rush hour ended strangers, passing copies down car aisles like proof. Editorial boards issued urgent notes with bullet points and receipts tying the quote to the audio, the map, and the invoice. At town squares, speakers blasted the clip on loop its crackle, as recognizable as a siren. People repeated the line to one another, not as gossip, but as a charge they meant to keep. Television leaned into the juxtaposition with surgical simplicity. Anchors teed up the question, then rolled the side-by-side Scott's earlier sneer at Jasmine Crockett, and the instant his body went still, when his own words filled the room. Analysts paused frames, noting a clenched jaw, a tightening finger on the bottle the exact second the smirk vanished. "This is the visual timeline," one said. Mockery evidence, silence. Across social feeds, the split screen became a meme for clarity. Veterans posted service photos beside the headline. Clergy read the line from pulpits and asked congregations to listen. Call-in shows lit up with voices not shouting, but grief. Everywhere, comparison held one side as the truth, the other is lies exposed. By the time the split screen looped through its 10th broadcast, the consequences began to move faster than the Chiron. News desks pushed the clip hourly, and offices that once hedged started answering calls. Producers kept the audio on a loop that felt like a heartbeat for the Capitol. Council drafted language chiefs counted votes and schedulers cleared rooms as if a storm were rolling down the hall. The file had stopped, but its shock kept running, and the next act arrived with the weight of inevitability. Before the second sunset, the leadership notice went out in stark, unornamented type. It acknowledged the gravity of the audio and the integrity issues attached to it. It affirmed process record and standards without wasting a word. Most importantly, it said what everyone could understand without a law degree. Within 48 hours, Senator Tim Scott was suspended from leadership and committee posts. Inboxes flashed, tickers turned red, and the building exhaled the breath it had been holding. The machinery followed with the speed of a fire drill. Security reprogrammed badge access and flagged restricted corridors. Calendars emptied, hearings vanished, and travel holds pinged across staff phones. Boxes appeared under framed photographs while interns printed statements no one wanted to read aloud. A nameplate came off a mahogany door with a soft metallic sigh that sounded accidental and final at once. Outside, a murmur became a march. Veterans assembled on the steps with flags, service caps, and the weight of their years. Wheelchairs formed a front-line chrome, catching the pale noon sun like mirrors held to power. A bullhorn clicked on, and a voice rang out, "We are not useless." The first repetition was ragged, the second steadier, the third a drum beat that shook the stone beneath their feet. By lunch, the phrase had jumped zip codes. In Houston, a VFW hall rolled a speaker card onto the sidewalk and turned it toward traffic. In Detroit, marchers hoisted portraits of fallen friends and stopped only long enough for news vans to arrive. In Phoenix, a Marine in his 80s tapped time with his cane and shouted until his voice cracked, then grinned through the crack. From curbs, pickup beds, and shaded porches, strung with small flags, came the answer, "We are not useless." Washington heard the chant as pressure and promise at once. Motorcades rerouted, barricades doubled, and officers kept shaking the same hands they asked to stand back. A nurse in scrubs set a toddler on her hip and taught him the words with a smile that did not soften her eyes. A double amputee raised both sleeves where his arms ended and spoke straight to a camera. "We are not useless." The lens seemed to nod like a person who finally understood what the day was about. Numbers then began to form into a verdict. Overnight polling asked a simple question about trust, and the curve jumped in a way veteran reporters admitted they rarely see. Jasmine Crockett's steadiness translated through glass as if the lens had been tuned for her. Call-in shows filled with voices repeating the same sentence in different accents. She told the truth. Anchors described her tone as measured, unflinching, almost surgical, and the description stuck. Her office became a relay for a country's pulse. Emails from military families stacked like sandbags against cynicism and fatigue. Veterans groups posted endorsements that read like promises and apologies at once. Volunteers inked the words, "We are not useless" on the poster board and pressed them flat with both palms. Staffers logged messages by the hundreds, then the thousands, and finally stopped trying to keep up. For Tim Scott, the portrait shifted from man to emblem. Editorial cartoons drew him facing a microphone that reflected his own voice back at him. Talk shows reduced the arc to 3 beats anyone could memorize: arrogance, exposure, collapse. A civics teacher wrote the sequence on a whiteboard and told her class, "This is what power without humility looks like." The country met the lesson, halfway recognizing a shape it had seen before and hoped not to see again. The suspension notice remained pinned at the top of feeds, its language cool and non-negotiable. Under it, videos of the chant stacked into a moving wall of faces, flags, and folded hands. "We are not useless" marched beneath headlines about rosters and procedural clocks, tying the abstract to the human in a way no memo can. America was shaken, and trust in Jasmine Crockett climbed with every replay. By the close of the 48 hours, Tim Scott stood as the shorthand for a powerful man, felled by arrogance and corruption. In small towns far from the capital, the shock landed the same way: sudden, heavy, impossible to ignore. Barbershops played the clip between trims. The line about veterans looped louder than the clippers. At grocery checkout lanes, people showed each other phone screens with the caption in bold. On church steps after evening services, the chant started softly and then gathered courage, a congregation finding one voice. Pollsters released crosstabs that showed the trust surge cutting across age, region, and party, with the sharpest rise among seniors and veterans. A caller to a late-night station said what many felt: she kept her cool. She respected us. She told the truth. Inside the Capitol, symbolism outran spin. Hallway cameras found Scott's corridor quiet as a library, while lobbyists who once lined the walls studied their shoes. A cartoonist sketched a marble statue labeled hubris, cracking along a fault named corruption, and the likeness was plain. Panel shows rolled the same 3 images until they fused: the smirk, the signature, the silence. People began using his name as shorthand in arguments. "Don't be a Scott," and everyone grasped the meaning without a footnote. In 48 hours, the arc had completed itself. Suspension delivered the veteran's cry ringing, the country jolted awake, and Jasmine Crockett standing where trust goes when it finds a home. And Scott's fall warned power what comes next. The 48-hour suspension had barely settled when the story crossed borders like a shockwave. International desks flipped their rundowns, bumped fluff pieces, and cut straight to the clip that had already branded itself into America's conscience. Translators huddled over headsets to render every syllable of the audio with clinical precision. Producers stitched a tight package: the smirk, the USB, the line, the silence. Within one news cycle, the narrative moved from a domestic scandal to a global reckoning carried on satellites and streaming apps. The world had its headline, and it traveled faster than jet lag. By sunrise in London, anchors on breakfast television held up early editions, stamped with the same stark banner, American Veteran Scandal. In Doha, studio walls pulsed with graphics as presenters replayed the audio and then rolled a wide shot of wheelchairs lined across Capitol steps. In Paris and Berlin, chyrons mirrored the English phrase so viewers could hear the original sting in the senator's voice. Tokyo's late-night programs paused their variety shows to run the side-by-side his mockery of Jasmine Crockett, and the instant he went mute. On digital feeds from Lagos to São Paulo, the clip auto-loaded beneath the headline in quotes unadorned and undeniable. It needed no embellishment. The sentence did all the work. Correspondents pushed beyond the palace of politics and into the homes and halls where service lives. A British veteran medal stitched to a blazer he only wore for funerals stared straight into camera and said, "We know what it means to be told you're finished. That's why we stand with them." A Canadian anchor cut to a Legion Hall where hands gripped coffee mugs and silence answered for everyone. In Sydney, a returned service club unfurled banners and invited American expatriates to sign a book of support. On a street in Warsaw, a woman who had served as a medic held up a printed transcript with the offending line underlined twice. Each frame added a local heartbeat to a global pulse that would not slow. The messages started arriving almost as quickly as the broadcasts. The Royal British Legion sent a statement, "We stand in solidarity with our American brothers and sisters in uniform and in recovery." The Royal Canadian Legion followed service does not end when the uniform comes off. Respect must not either. Australia's Returned in Services League issued a brief but pointed note. "Dignity for veterans is not a partisan asset. It is the price of our freedoms." NATO veterans associations signaled unity, shifting logos aside so the shared words could breathe on a single page. Even small-town posts from Ireland to New Zealand circulated letters signed by dozens of names written in slow-block capitals that spoke of age duty and pain carried well. More than statements, the solidarity took shape you could touch. In London, poppy wreaths appeared beneath the cenotaph with handwritten cards addressed to our American friends. In Ottawa, a military museum lit its facade in muted tones and invited visitors to write notes to U.S. veterans on a wall that filled by noon. In Auckland, a brass band gathered without rehearsal and played hymns an hour before the doors opened. In Naples, a sailors' association recorded a simple video, veterans sitting shoulder to shoulder, each saying one sentence, "You are not useless," in their own language. Across continents, strangers found the same cadence for the same promise, a chorus without a conductor. As the world spoke, the capital moved. The leadership that had already removed Tim Scott from posts shifted into a new gear that did not creak. Committee chairs met behind closed doors with counsel and prosecutors aligning timelines and powers like gears that could not afford to slip. Subpoenas drafted in one room were laser printed and signed in another, the ink still tacky as envelopes sealed. The formal phrase went live on a microphone that belonged to no party. "Congress will open a criminal investigation." Staffers sent the letters to Palmetto State Constructors, Inc., to Evan Pike, campaign finance director, to Daniel Huxley, household manager at 14 Seaglass Way, and to a web of banks whose routing numbers matched the map on the giant LED wall. Every piece of paper carried the gravity of the chamber that birthed it. The legal path ahead was not a cable graphic, but a map of statutes with sharp edges. Counsel outlined potential counts that fit the evidence already: public wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement of charitable funds, obstruction. They spoke in cool voices about penalties measured in years, not news cycles and the mechanics of grand juries that do not clap for speeches. A judge in chambers reviewed applications for records and quietly set a schedule that respected rights and respected urgency. Scott's attorneys huddled and exchanged tablets, sharp whispers slipping out cooperation, proffer exposure phrases that feel like lifelines and sound like surrender. Inside, an old calculus was being redrawn with new numbers. Papers were served. The images went public. A process server whose face nobody would remember lifted a manila packet with the calm of a metronome and handed necessity across a threshold. Banks acknowledged holds. A passport office pinged an alert. A security detail rerouted. A calendar bleached itself of future plans. In a courthouse few have seen on camera, clerks entered case numbers with the care of jewelers setting stones. Nothing loud occurred, and yet the scrape of a pen on a docket sheet echoed like a gavel. While the machinery inched forward, the global echo chamber lifted one voice above the others. Jasmine Crockett moved through interviews with the same steady cadence she carried at the mic-declining ornament in favor of facts, and the same 6 words evidence spoke. I let it speak. Editorial boards that often split down predictable lines agreed on the same description, the voice that cannot be silenced. A Spanish headline translated it cleanly and gave it back to English with a sheen. A Japanese program wrote it on screen as a subtitle that glowed but did not shout. Audiences repeated it in call-ins on street corners and outside consulates where flowers and flags shared space. The title fit as if it had been waiting for the moment to choose its owner. International broadcasters kept the drumbeat tight and relentless. A BBC anchor framed the story as a test of democratic self-repair. Can a system recognize rot and excise it without rage consuming the patient? An Al Jazeera panel weighed the cultural wound of calling veterans useless against the legal consequences of misuse of funds, returning to the same split screen that had hardened the public verdict. France 24 described the grand jury as a civic ritual as sacred as a parade, and NHK tracked the investigative timeline on a minimalist graphic that made patience look like power. The refrain on every channel, even in translation, retained the exact phrase in quotation marks, American veteran scandal. It had become the common label for a truth that could not be softened without lying. Veteran organizations coordinated across borders with the precision of people used to missions. They drafted a joint letter that began with one sentence: "We honor service by honoring the promises made to those who served." It listed practical steps, legal advocacy, emergency grants for those denied care, and cross-national counseling networks to manage the surge of grief the story had unlocked. Leaders convened on a secure video call and took turns reading names of those they had lost, allowing silence after each, as if the list itself were a flag. At the end, one of them asked for that sentence again: "You are not useless," and the line came back in 8 languages, steady and level. No slogans, no music, just the promise. Back home, the formal letters that launched the criminal investigation became public record and front-page ink. Committees announced hearing dates and witness orders that named names without theatrics. Reporters posted the docket entries with arrows to the counts, their tweets dry and devastating. A law professor went on air and said, "This is not about whether a speech was mean. This is about whether money meant for veterans was criminally diverted." The distinction calmed the noise without cooling the heat. It sharpened the picture in a way that both a judge and a bus driver could respect. As investigators moved, Crockett's image traveled its own route. Murals went up in neighborhoods that do not wait for permission, paint thrown like confetti across brick until a face and a microphone emerged. A photo of her lifting the USB started appearing in storefront windows, beside handwritten notes from veterans and spouses. At a town hall in a county that usually votes the other way, an older man stood and said only, "Thank you for not shouting," and the room clapped longer than some speeches last. Editorial cartoons reimagined the USB as a lantern held in her hand, light spilling into rooms long kept dark. The nickname returned in comment sections and newscasts until it felt less like praise and more like identification, the voice that cannot be silenced. Meanwhile, the scandal kept circling the planet with fresh context and familiar outrage. In Seoul, a veteran of peacekeeping duty spoke softly about dignity and asked viewers to remember that budgets are moral documents. In Nairobi, a host reminded audiences that solidarity means refusing to let anyone erase sacrifice when it becomes inconvenient. In Buenos Aires, a debate show cut the panel and played the audio again, letting the cold tape do what rhetoric cannot. London's nightly news closed with a camera pushing into rows of poppies and a caption that read, "Honor lives in how you spend." The planet seemed to agree on at least one sentence, and the work it demanded. The phrase criminal investigation did not fade after the first cycle. It rooted. Subpoena returns would take time, testimony would need to be compelled, and motions would grind as they always do. But the direction of travel was fixed, and even the most cynical watchers admitted the compass needle was steady. Scott faced a sober future, measured not in polls, but in counts, not in interviews, but in appearances nobody welcomes. His counsel kept their language careful while the public language grew plainer. He faces prison. The bluntness embarrassed no one. It matched the facts on the screen. In the galleries and on the sidewalks, the people who had animated this story with their presence kept their focus. Veterans walked together without signs, some days content to be seen in the same frame that had once framed their erasure. Families lit candles on stoops and recited the service branch of a loved one like a prayer. Street preachers turned down their amplifiers and read the names of soldiers over traffic, as if reclaiming sound from noise. Everywhere the chorus laid the same line over the day's footage like a score. We are not useless. It was not a chant anymore. It was a boundary. The international press, the veterans' solidarity, the criminal machinery, and the rise of a single steady voice braided into one rope you could hold. If you tugged on any strand, the others tightened and the whole line held. American Veteran Scandal stayed at the top of our, not because producers love scandal, but because the facts refused to shrink. Congress had opened the door to charges that could take a man's liberty, and the world understood the stakes with uncommon clarity. On screens and steps and pages, the story said the same thing 3 ways the news had gone global. The veterans were united, the law was moving, and Jasmine Crockett was to millions the voice that cannot be silenced. The roar of the crowd and the drumbeat of headlines finally thinned to a hard-focused quiet, and in that quiet the story tightened into something simple enough to carry in a single breath. It no longer needed a dozen clips and a stack of exhibits to be understood. It fit on a card, on a poster, on a front page, in a font you could read from across the street. 3 lines held the whole weight: words have a price. Corruption can't hide. Justice needs someone to stand up. Everything else, the LED maps, the invoices, the chants, became proof orbiting those suns. The scandal had found its shape. First came the lesson everyone could feel in their bones. Words have a price. 1 sentence. They are useless, ripped across the country like broken glass, poured into a river shimmering, sinking, and cutting anyway. It lived as sound and as text, as a caption, and a crawl, as a ringtone people refused to answer. In bars and kitchens and bus stops, the line replayed and replayed until it rewrote a biography that once seemed unbreakable. Careers usually erode like shorelines. This one cracked like ice, loud and sudden. A lifetime of polish could not outshine a single sentence spoken into a wire. People listed the cost in a language anyone could do the math on. A former supporter whispered, "He said it himself," and turned a check into a shred. A staffer folded a lapel pin into a drawer and closed it, as if easing a door on a sleeping room. A donor took his name off a plaque and left a blank rectangle that said more than any engraving. Editors swapped embattled for disgraced without a meeting. All of it stemmed from the same debt stamped by the same word, a price exacted not by rivals but by tape. Networks drew the arc in 2 frames and let silence connect them. Frame 1, the smirk, the scoff the line meant to belittle Jasmine Crockett. Frame 2, the face gone slack when his own voice filled the chamber and erased the smirk he'd been leaning on. No music, no commentary, only the quiet between those images as a country calibrated its judgment. Parents explained to kids why a sentence can weigh more than a speech. Teachers paused class and said, "This is why you don't talk about people who serve like that." The first lesson settled like a verdict: words have a price. The second lesson came with numbers, arrows, and the cold comfort of math corruption can't hide. 47 transfers, $32 million a company, with a familiar last name and invoice for $5 million signed in wet ink. Money tried to wear a mask shell, companies' vague memos, residential improvements, but the trail glowed like runway lights in fog. Timestamps lined up, routing numbers repeated like a tell. Ledger entries in one book matched deliveries on a loading dock camera in another city. Every proof touched another proof until it was less a chain than a welded bar. Viewers who had never seen a wire sheet learned to read one because the lines themselves told the story. On the LED wall, red paths leapt from donor accounts to a brand new tennis court and a wine cellar drilled into stone. On a table, a household manager said, "I watched him walk the cellar," and no one could wave that away. A campaign finance director's name on the file header answered questions before they were asked. "Every dollar leaves a footprint," a commentator said, and the phrase turned into a tool you could hold in your hand. The map didn't just point at accused. Images welded themselves to conscience in ways that don't fade. A pool blue enough to look unreal, a four-car garage bigger than some clinics, a climate-controlled room for bottles that cost more than a wheelchair waiting for a grant that never came. The arithmetic was unforgiving subtract care. Add, luxury multiply outrage. People stopped calling it a scandal and started calling it theft because they could see the subtraction and the addition at the same time. Then the third lesson stepped forward, not as a slogan, but as a person at a microphone. Justice needs someone to stand up. Jasmine Crockett didn't shout. She steadied the room. She didn't gild the evidence. She laid it out and let it burn on its own oxygen. When an attack came, she didn't swing back with insult. She moved a finger plugged in a drive and gave the floor to the truth. Evidence spoke. I let it speak, she said later, and the line traveled because restraint travels farther than rage. Calm became a kind of force. People outside the Capitol recognized the shape of leadership without being coached. Veterans with gravel in their voices said, "She listened to us." Nurses on break rooms said she didn't waste words. A pastor said from a pulpit, courage is sometimes the choice not to talk when the tape can talk better. Editorial pages, usually allergic to agreement, aligned on a phrase borrowed from viewers who had already settled on it, the voice that cannot be silenced. The nickname wasn't about volume. It was about a refusal to look away when it would have been easier to let the noise win. The distilled story fit on index cards and still carried the charge of live TV. Words have a price, a career shattered in real time because a sentence revealed a soul. Corruption can't hide numbers, and signatures walk the public from outrage to proof. Justice needs someone to stand up. One member of Congress did, and millions saw the difference between theater and accountability. People repeated the trio like a creed, not because it was catchy, but because it was true. The country had been handed a simple test and had passed it out loud. By evening, the narrative took its final turn toward the door, where the air tastes different and the flashes are brighter. The hallway outside the hearing room narrowed under the weight of bodies pressing inward. Photographers stretched their arms into a thicket. Boom mics tilted like spears. Shoes squeaked on polished floor. A sergeant-at-arms raised a palm that slowed nothing. Doors creaked, cracked, and then swung wide enough to spill reporters into a bright square of marble. Somewhere down the hall, the chant that had been a drum all day thumped once and stilled. Jasmine Crockett stepped into that square like a diver breaking the surface. The heat from the lights and the press of the crowd ran up her face and vanished as if her skin knew how to turn it off. Questions bombarded, some shouted, some pleaded, some thrown like hooks. Will you push for expulsion? Do you believe the investigation will lead to charges? What do you say to veterans watching tonight? Hands waved, pens scratched, lenses clicked. She did not flinch. She did not scan for the friendly mic. She did not measure which soundbite might play best at 6. She stopped at the tape line that had been laid down in gray and stepped neither over it nor back from it. The room held its breath on instinct the way a crowd does before a starter pistol. Her eyes found the center of the crush and then softened as if she had picked out one person to speak to in a hallway of hundreds. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was packed with expectation, with anger looking for words that would not waste it. A voice near her elbow tried to cut in. Another voice hushed it with a look. She raised the mic by inches. Her answer did not arrive dressed for television. It arrived dressed for gravesides and kitchens and long rides home from bad news. She did not sell a policy or spit a threat. She did not count votes or rehearse timelines. She gave the moment back to the people it belonged to and let the language land where it needed to land most. Then she spoke plainly and fully without a tremor and without a second sentence to cushion it. The flashbulbs faded, but the words lingered like a scar across the nation's memory. The scandal was no longer just about money, nor even about power. It was about meaning, what is sacred, what is owed, and what can never be sold without destroying the soul of a country. People replayed the scene not only for the drama of politics, but because something deeper had broken open. Out of the noise came a lesson so sharp and human that no one could mistake it. The first human truth was about language. Words matter. They can build or destroy. They can carry respect or broadcast contempt. Tim Scott's line, "They are useless," proved that a sentence can become a weapon more damaging than any document. It didn't come from an opponent's mouth, it came from his own. And once the world heard it, there was no spin, no retraction, no rewrite. People saw it for what it was, the mask pulled off by the man himself. At kitchen tables and veterans' halls, the lesson landed heavy. A father turned to his teenage son and said, "That's why you don't ever belittle sacrifice." Not even once. A mother shook her head at the television and whispered, "He destroyed himself with his own tongue." The words carved a wound, but they also carved clarity. Speech is power, and power abused always collapses on itself. The second truth struck through the numbers. Corruption thinks it can hide in ink and ledgers, in shell companies and code names, but every dollar leaves a trail. People who had never once studied a wire transfer learned to trace lines of money as if they were detectives. On the screen, the red arrows leading from donations to luxury made a story clearer than any speech could. "Every dollar has a footprint," one journalist said, and the phrase became a rallying cry. For veterans, the lesson was cruel, but unshakable promises can be betrayed by greed, but evidence will eventually catch the liar. For ordinary families, the point was simple. You cannot bury truth under concrete wine cellars or tennis courts. It will always surface, dragging guilt with it. But the deepest lesson came from the contrast between arrogance and courage. Tim Scott mocked, sneered, and tried to twist the spotlight into a weapon. Jasmine Crockett did not answer with venom. She answered with patience, with evidence, with steel that did not need to shout. Her composure became the moral of the story, that justice does not require rage, it requires resolve. In her, the country saw that one person standing firm can become the hinge between lies and truth. A veteran in a wheelchair watching from home summed it up best. "She didn't speak for herself. She spoke for us because we couldn't be in that room." And in that recognition lay the final human lesson. Justice isn't automatic. It needs someone willing to take the blows, to stand where the air is thick with pressure, and to say the words others cannot. The pace of the scandal turned these truths into something like parables. Schools replayed the clips not for civics alone, but as moral examples. Teachers paused videos and asked, "What do you think was lost when he said those words? What was gained when she stood silent and let the tape speak?" In churches, preachers lifted the line. "They are useless," and turned it into a sermon about dignity, how no one who has sacrificed for others can ever be useless. In community centers, volunteers handed out flyers that read, "Corruption leaves a trail. Truth leaves light. Choose your path." Everywhere the scandal went, it taught not through lectures, but through raw drama that nobody could ignore. Another layer of the lesson was humility. Pride had carried Tim Scott into that chamber, convinced that years of polished allies and a smile could shield him. He thought he could laugh off questions, mock witnesses, and sneer at evidence. But pride has always been brittle when struck against truth. His fall reminded people that arrogance doesn't protect, it exposes. "Hubris destroys faster than hate," one commentator said, and the phrase ricocheted across screens. The image of him sweating, fumbling for a water bottle, and falling into silence became the embodiment of what pride looks like when it collapses. Children saw it and learned a wordless warning: never believe you are untouchable, because truth can touch anyone. And then came the lesson about dignity, drawn not from the guilty, but from those who suffered. Veterans marched on crutches and wheels chanting, "We are not useless," and the chant traveled faster than any headline. In their faces, America was reminded that sacrifice never expires. Legs lost in Fallujah, arms gone in Kandahar, scars carried from decades past, all of it stood in direct defiance of that one cruel sentence. A veteran with no legs lifted his rejection letter and said, "This is what betrayal looks like." But when he joined the chant, he showed what resilience looks like. The human lesson was crystal. Those who gave to the country are not useless. It is those who steal from them who forfeit worth. For Jasmine Crockett, the lesson she carried was heavier than victory. It was about responsibility. People looked at her not only as the one who exposed corruption, but as a symbol that truth requires defenders. "She's the voice that cannot be silenced," headlines said. But behind that praise was a reminder: if she had stayed silent, the lie might have stood. Her resolve turned into a mirror for others. Citizens began asking themselves, "What do I do when I see wrong? Do I stay quiet or do I step forward? In that way, the story spread from one scandal into thousands of small awakenings. The world itself read the scandal like a parable. Global broadcasts turned it into shorthand for the dangers of contempt and greed. Veterans in other countries posted messages, "You are not useless." Students in classrooms far from Washington replayed the clips and debated them. Commentators in Europe called it a democratic morality play. In Asia, one anchor said, "This story proves that truth crosses borders the same way lies do." The universality of the lesson was undeniable. Sacrifice is never useless, and betrayal is never hidden forever. And finally, the story crystallized into one last truth. Justice is not abstract. It has a face, a voice, a moment when someone refuses to be silent. In the final scene, Jasmine Crockett, stepping out of that hearing room, carried the entire weight of the scandal in her calm posture. Reporters swarmed, shoving microphones, shouting questions. She did not deliver a speech. She delivered a truth that belonged not to her, but to every soldier, every family, every citizen watching. No one is useless when they have sacrificed for this country. Only a traitor is truly useless. The line hit like the closing argument of a trial America had been watching from living rooms and sidewalks. The human lesson then was clear enough to fit in a few words, but vast enough to shake a nation. Words have power, so guard them. Corruption leaves a trail, so follow it. Justice requires courage, so stand up. And sacrifice is never useless, so honor it. Those truths turned a scandal into a moral compass, reminding millions that the difference between betrayal and honor, between silence and truth, between arrogance and justice, is always one voice willing to speak when it matters most. The words still hung in the air, like smoke from a gunshot when the focus shifted from shock to action. The scandal had stripped away illusions, and what remained was a call that no one could pretend not to hear. Jasmine Crockett had shown what courage looked like, but courage wasn't meant to be rare. It was meant to spread. People watching from their homes, their offices, their cars understood that the story was no longer just about one senator or one committee. It was about everyone who believed sacrifice deserves honor, not betrayal. The silence that followed her final words begged to be filled not with outrage alone, but with movement. The first step was obvious: never let words like, "They are useless," pass unchallenged again. Viewers repeated the phrase to themselves, not as an echo of insult, but as a warning. Words have weight, a teacher told her students the next morning. So weigh yours carefully and hold others accountable when they abuse theirs. At kitchen tables, parents told their children, "If you ever hear someone belittle a veteran, speak up." The scandal became a living reminder that indifference is complicity. A single voice had brought the truth to light. Millions of voices could ensure it never went dark again. But action meant more than speaking, it meant demanding. We can't just watch this one veteran set into a local news camera, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair. We have to demand laws that guard against theft and betrayal. Calls for reform surged across the country: stricter oversight for charity funds, harsher penalties for misusing veteran resources, mandatory transparency for transfers. Civic groups that had long begged for attention suddenly found the spotlight, and they seized it. Their petitions filled with signatures in hours, and their hotlines buzzed like never before. The message was clear: corruption doesn't vanish in silence, it withers under relentless demand for justice. Action also meant solidarity. Veterans' halls became rally points, and families gathered with candles, posters, and flags, not just to protest, but to protect dignity. In one small town, a crowd of teenagers stood alongside aging veterans and chanted, "We are not useless," until their throats cracked. That chant wasn't only defiance, it was a reminder of unity that crossed age, class, and politics. Solidarity was its own form of action, proving that when arrogance tries to erase sacrifice, the people will write it back in ink too bold to miss. And finally, the call to action turned personal. It wasn't only about senators' hearings or scandals. It was about the neighbor who struggles in silence, the veteran who hesitates to ask for help, the widow who holds folded flags but no support. "Look around you," Crockett had urged off camera. "Find who needs you and stand with them. Don't wait for someone else to step forward." That was the action ordinary citizens could take one by one, until the chant was not only on the Capitol steps, but in every community. The scandal had revealed betrayal. The response had to reveal resolve. The call to action was not complicated speak when others stay silent, demand when others shrug, stand when others sit. Because justice does not survive on its own, it survives when people choose to carry it, protect it, and live it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.